I want these lines to go through this whole entire object. And so I'm going to go ahead and put this out on my scratch board. The scratch board we want to be clear at the end of the project, but it's a great place to kind of play around with what we're trying to accomplish. So I'm going to make a copy just by clicking on this object, holding down my Option key till I get the double arrow so that I have 2 copies of this line thing that I just made to work with. All right? And then I'm going to hover this object on top of this set of circles that I made. All right? Now you'll notice that it's a little bit bigger than the circle, and that's perfect. That's what I want it to be. So I want these lines to make this circle. So here's the key to using a shape to cut something else out. If I'm using a shape and I'm using this tool to cut something out, or I'm using a clipping mask, the rule is whatever the shape is, so think of that shape like a stencil. That stencil has to be the topmost object on the layer of what I'm trying to cut out. All right? So in Illustrator, everything I draw becomes the topmost thing on that layer. So these lines that I made second are in front of that. So I simply grab my lines, go to Object, Arrange, Send to Back. Okay? Then I like to just click and drag over those 2 items together. And in a perfect world, I now can tell it that where this shape overlaps these shapes, I want there to be something, but outside of it, I want there to be nothing. So if I go here and I go to intersect, it says, no way, lady. These aren't shapes. That doesn't mean I can't do it. What it means is I have to do it smart. So when I connected these lines, it created a long math equation to tell Illustrator, take the biggest line, the littlest line, blend them together, and have 12 steps in between. I need to now make these isolated objects to go to the next step. So a real easy way to do this is to use a command called expand. And what expand does is it takes that blend and all that complicated math and it changes it into shapes. It's great once I have it the way I want it, but I can no longer adjust my blend once I do this. But for here I don't need to because I made that fancy copy. So I'm going to go ahead and say expand, object and fill, and I'm going to click on OK, and now you'll see that this is a series of shapes. So I click on the circle on top, I hold down my Shift key and grab the objects in back, and let's give it another shot. Oh no, same problem. Okay, not a problem. There's always a solution. So now we're going to take these linear objects, we've expanded them, but Illustrator now sees it as a whole bunch of shapes and says, no way, lady, I don't know what you're talking about. So we got to simplify it, and that is under the same pull-down menu. So before we used expand to make it a series of rectangles, now we're going to use, yep, totally just went blank. Now we're going to use compound path, make. And so now what it's going to do is it's going to say make these series of rectangles into their own shape. Now, it doesn't help us when they all of a sudden turn to none, so let's go ahead and swap that back and make it so that we've got a fill of black and a stroke of none. And then let's take this object here and what do we do? Hold on, I'm going back. So number 1 is to expand. I went back a little too far. And actually we can do it just with the fill. Let's do that. Okay. And then Let's see if it works. I don't know why it's showing up that way. Always when I'm in front of people is when these things happen. We want where they overlap to be shapes. All right, it worked. It just is not giving me the color. So if I have those in order, once I make it a compound path, I can grab both of those objects together, making sure the circle's on top, and I can go ahead and tell it to knock out the other area, and then I have this nice shape that goes right to the edge of my page, and I can inch that right up to the edge of my page, and we're all pretty happy. Agree? So now let's say we want to do this, and we want to switch this around. Because I left this as a group, I can still edit this, which is really fun, right? I can't do that once I make it objects, but here I could do this now, and I could put this on, let's change this to back, and drag that down there. Unlock that layer, drag it down, and turn this layer on. And go ahead and lock that layer. So now I've got these two layers. I've got my lined circle here. I've got this stuff here. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this lined circle, move it off to the side, rotate it around, make it bigger. And line this up with my page here. Do something kind of like that. And then at the same time, that's not at all what I want it to look like. So I'm going to go ahead on that layer, grab my ellipse tool, lock up my other layers, and a couple of different ways to do this, but I'm going to eyeball it for now, and I'm going to make a white circle that's about the same size. I'm going to fill it with white. I'm going to stroke it with none, and I'm going to go ahead and pull this here and scale it just a little bit. All right, so this is literally where I want this to cut off, and I want it to cut off on that edge, and I'm going to use the same thing I showed you before for doing this. I'm going to go ahead and just go zoop, and very simply say where they overlap, I want it to cut off completely, and I just want to have that one little shape right there. Okay, and then I'm going to take this guy, and I'm going to say object, arrange, bring to front. So now I've got those two objects together, and if I want them to move together, that's fantastic. I can scroll it up, scroll it down, change whatever I want about that. I can turn the whole thing around and line it up over here so we can see it a little bit better. And I can decide where I want it to be. So now that this is knocked out, if I want it to be here and I get it where I want it, now I've got some random stuff off the edge of my page, right? So if I take this guy here and I want to put a little circle, same sort of scale again. I like to do a corner to corner, hold down my shift key, give myself that circle about the size that I need it, make it white, stroke it with none. You'll notice I'm using two different ways to do line and stroke. There's no right way except for the right way for you because it feels right. So you can do that however you want it. I'm going to go ahead and get this in here. I'm going to go to Object, Arrange, Send to Back. And because I'm on that top layer, it's going to send this circle behind that other shape that I made there, which is great. And then if I want to trim this off, I can use that same technique I did before. Or here's another option. Let's scroll through here. Let's get this the size we want it to be. So it's coming right up to that edge there. And another way that I can cut this off is to go ahead in here and underneath the eraser tool. So if I click on that little arrow in the bottom is the scissor tool. I think it's the most underused tool that is pretty amazing once you learn how to use it. Because now I can just come in here with the scissor and you'll notice when I hover over my circle, which is selected, I get a little point. It'll trim it off right there. And then trim this off right here. And then I can grab my selection tool and I can grab just the bottom portion. Hope it wants the direct selection. And I should be able, nope, best laid plans. Grab grab my scissor. I'm doing a clip, which is there. Maybe it didn't get my clip here. There we go. Now we should have two separate parts. Boom. All right, so what I did is I actually now cut off that circle. Now the reason people don't like to use this is there is one added step, but it makes it super flexible later, is that I can just go ahead here, and anytime I want to restart a line, I'll get that little circle next to my pen, and then I can just drag it over to here and close that path. So now it's made it a circle. I go to Object, Arrange, Send to Back, and now I've got these items here connected. So I can click and drag to grab those two things together, and I can tell them to group. And as I'm working on this, I realize that I want this to shift a little bit. Now that I've got two things on the same layer and things are getting a bit more complicated, I probably don't want to cut every single little bit of thing. But I did ask you to make sure that everything aligns to the edge of your page, right? That there's no stuff off in the ether. So does anyone know what I could do to cut these off on the edges most easily? I'm going to move this a little just to make it more interesting. Nobody? No guesses? So here's where layers are super important. I've got all these objects together. I'm going to go ahead now that I have them where I want them, and I'm going to use Object Group or Command G so that they're all selected as one. So now when I click on one, I get all three, right? I'm then going to take my rectangle tool and I'm going to draw it right to the edge of my page, like so. And I'm not going to worry too much about the color. And I'm going to hold down my Shift key and grab that grouped object. So you can see now that both things are selected, yes? And then I'm going to use an absolutely awesome thing. Absolutely awesome when you use it right, but if you cut off every single thing in your illustration using what I'm about to show you, it will be a monster of a file that will process very slowly, both while you're working on it and just printing it out. But when you have something more complicated like this, it's super helpful. So I'm going to go up here with, again, I drew the square on top to the size of the artboard. Let's adjust it so it's accurate. Then I held down my Shift key and with my selection tool, grab this stuff behind it. And then I'm going to use Object, Clipping Mask, Make. So Object, Clipping Mask, Make. And it cuts it all off for me. So when I do a Command A, it's all contained. Pretty cool. Now, I just did that whole demo without saving it all. That's super horrible practice. That was a real bad example on my behalf. Command S should become your best friend. If you learn one keystroke all semester, it should be Command S. Demo 2. And this would live in my designs folder. And so I'm going to go ahead and save it into that folder. And I'm going to click on OK.